If you pay for Claude, you probably got an email from Anthropic on the 14th. The headline number was generous and easy to remember. For those of us on the max plan, $200 of SDK credits a month for free starting on the 15th of June. The email explained it like this. From June, every paid Claude subscriber will get a separate monthly budget called an Agent SDK credit. Pro plans get $20, Max 5x get $100, and Max 20x get $200. So basically, you get the full amount of your subscription cost back in SDK credits on top of your pre-existing allowance. The credit pays for things that talk to Claude through code rather than through the chat window. The Agent SDK, the Claude TAC-P command, GitHub Actions, and third-party apps like OpenClaw and Conductor. The framing was warm. We heard your questions, your subscription limits don't change, programmatic usage gets its own budget. And it sounds like Anthropic noticed that people were running into walls, and particularly things like OpenClaw were frustrating people that they had to use API keys and expensive costs in order to run these projects. And that's the version that Anthropic wants you to focus on. The longer version is more interesting and it explains a lot about where Claude is heading over the next year. 3 things are missing from the announcement that change how you should read it. Firstly, the $200 credit is billed at standard API prices, not at the subsidized rate that you get inside the subscription. The subscription is a bargain, to be fair, and the credit is not. By most reasonable estimates, a $200 Max 20x subscription buys you something like $5,000 of equivalent API usage if you bought the same tokens directly. So your free $200 is closer to 1/25th of the value of the subscription it sits next to. It's a real number, but it's nowhere near as generous. Secondly, the Claude-P command, the simple way to call Claude from a shell script, is being moved out of your subscription quota and into the new credit. And this is the really big one. So today, if you pipe a git diff into Claude-P and you ask for a commit message, that call comes out of your flat rate subscription. So again, think of it like being taken out of the $5,000 of subscription allowance you have. From the 15th of June, it's going to be billed at API rates. So heavy script users will notice this very, very quickly. And thirdly, the credit is use it or lose it. It doesn't roll over, and when it runs out, your programmatic calls stop unless you've turned on extra usage billing, which is charged at the same API rates against your card. Now, this one is kind of less important in my mind because subscriptions generally are use it or lose it. So I think this is the less important, but still worth noting. So the actual shape of the offer is now, here's a small capped API allowance billed at full price that replaces that much larger informal allowance you were quietly getting before. And at the moment, it's not necessarily a bad deal, but it isn't the gift either that Anthropic is pretending it is. And the next 9 months explain why Anthropic needed to make the change. To understand the credit, you need to understand the bigger problem Anthropic has been wrestling with since late last year. The short version is too many users and not enough chips. And by chips, I mean GPUs, not French fries. And a price list that doesn't add up. Anthropic builds Claude. And to run Claude, they need huge stocks of computer chips, which are GPUs, and similar specialized chips from Google and Amazon. These chips are scarce, expensive, and take years to plan for. In an internal note that leaked into the press in May, Anthropic admitted that they had planned for 10 times growth a year. They got 80 times growth in the first quarter of 2026. They got 8 times the growth that they were hoping for within the first quarter, which is quite incredible. So the chips they'd ordered for the whole year were swallowed in like literally weeks. This is the root cause of almost every painful change Claude users have seen this year so far. There simply weren't enough chips to give every paying subscriber an unlimited share of Claude. As I've already mentioned, Claude subscriptions are a flat fee. They're $20, $100, or $200 a month, depending on which plan you're on. And inside that fee, you get a generous amount of usage compared to the API process. But usage is measured in tokens, and tokens have an underlying cost. For heavy users, the math gets pretty ugly pretty fast. A serious Claude Code user on the $200 Max 20x plan can chew through tokens that would cost thousands of dollars at standard API prices. Anthropic has been effectively subsidizing every heavy user, hoping that the light users on the same plan will balance it out. When demand exploded earlier this year, their math stopped working and the heavy users were no longer the outliers, and tools like Claude Code, with its long sessions and big context windows, encouraged exactly the workflow that burned the most token. A bug that lasted weeks in Claude Code version 2.1.100 even added around 20,000 invisible tokens to every request. quietly making the problem worse. So Anthropic was losing money on its most engaged customers. The chip shortage made that loss impossible to absorb. Last month, March 2026, the first cracks appeared and Anthropic introduced peak hours throttling, which went down like a proverbial sandwich. During busy times of the day, basically mornings in the US and afternoons in the UK, session limits got smaller and people reported their 5-hour limit being used up in less than 3 hours. By the end of March, Anthropic admitted publicly that people are hitting usage limits in Claude Code way faster than expected, and weekly rate limits got tightened even further. Pro plan users started reporting their quotas were maxing out by Monday afternoon, leaving them with nothing left for the rest of the week. And the backlash was loud. Reddit threads filled with cancellation announcements, longtime users compared the experience to Netflix introducing adverts, and X was a platform for the dissenters. Fast forward now to the beginning of this month, so April 2026, and Anthropic took a bigger swing. They blocked third-party tools from using subscription accounts explicitly, and their main target was obviously OpenClaw, the open source agent framework that you're probably familiar with that lets developers wire up Claude and many other models to do real work, including things like read emails, manage calendars, write code in the background. And the technical reason mattered. Anthropic's own tools like Claude Code are designed to make the most of something called a prompt cache, which dramatically lowers the actual cost of repeated requests. OpenClaw and similar tools didn't use the cache as well, so the same conversation cost Anthropic more to serve than it would have cost inside Claude Code. With flat rate subscriptions, that cost difference came straight out of Anthropic's bottom line. A few days later, on the 10th of April, Anthropic then went further and temporarily banned OpenClaw's creator from accessing Claude at all. The community read it as a warning shot. However, on the 21st of April, eagle-eyed users noticed Anthropic had quietly updated their pricing page. Claude Code was no longer listed as part of the $20 Pro plan. The change was reversed within 24 hours after the news spread on Hacker News and on Reddit. Anthropic later said it was a small test on about 2% of new signups, but the meaning was clear. The company was actively exploring whether the cheapest plan should lose access to its most expensive feature. And then in early May, the picture shifted. Anthropic signed an enormous run of deals to buy more compute. SpaceX announced on the 6th of May access to the entire Colossus 1 data center, which is 300 megawatts of power and over 220,000 NVIDIA GPUs available within weeks. And Google and Broadcom, a $200 billion 5-year deal for 5 gigawatts of Google's TPU chips coming online from 2027. With Amazon, a separate 5 gigawatt agreement worth more than $100 billion over 10 years using Amazon's Trainium chips. Microsoft and NVIDIA, $30 billion of Azure capacity, and FluidStack, a $50 billion investment in American AI infrastructure. Add it all up, and Anthropic now has roughly 10 gigawatts of computing capacity reserved across multiple partners. The numbers are mind-bending, but here is the point. Most of that capacity isn't online yet. Some arrives in late 2026, and some not until next year and beyond. And the SpaceX deal helps now, the rest is promises for later. In the meantime, Anthropic still has to manage demand with the chips they have. The 50% temporary increase to weekly Claude Code limits, announced on 7th of May and running until the 13th of July, was their first attempt to give users some breathing room while SpaceX comes online. Once you see the timeline, the new credit stops looking like a gift and starts looking like a careful piece of plumbing. It does several things at once. Firstly, it separates the heavy automation users from the chat users. The biggest source of unpredictable load on Claude's subscription system was scripted programmatic usage. Agents running in the background, harnesses like OpenClaw, scripts piping through the Claude-P, and by moving all of that to a fixed dollar API priced budget, Anthropic makes the cost of automation predictable for itself. Secondly, it quietly removes a subsidy. So today, when you run Claude-P from a shell script, you're getting a subsidized tokens. From June, those core costs are at API rates, although you get some of it subsidized at the first $200, which sounds like a top-up but actually replaces something that was effectively unlimited inside your plan. And thirdly, it legitimizes OpenClaw and similar tools, but only on Anthropic's terms. 6 weeks ago, Anthropic banned third-party harnesses. Now they're back on the menu, but they draw against the same capped full-price budget, which is essentially what they wanted in the first place, was that you had to use an API token. That makes them workable for hobby use, but impossible for serious commercial use without a separate API contract. Anthropic gets to claim openness while making sure the heaviest third-party users end up paying full API prices. And finally, It reserves the subsidized flat rate plan for what Anthropic actually wants people to do. Sit in front of Claude Code or the chat window and use Claude interactively. That's the experience Anthropic can control, optimize, and cache efficiently. This is a smart move from a business that needs to stop the bleeding. It is not, however, the user-led generous improvements the email describes. The honest read depends entirely on how you use Claude today. You win if you mostly use Claude interactively for chat sessions, IDE work, the occasional Claude Code session. Your subscription limits no longer get eaten by background scripts or third-party agents. The interactive experience may even feel a little snappier as the compute situation improves. You break even if you write the occasional shell script that calls Claude-P, a handful of small calls a day that will fit comfortably inside the new credit on any plan. And you'll lose if you've built a workflow that depends on subsidized tokens for automation. That includes anyone running OpenClaw, OpenCode, or Conductor as more than just a toy. It includes anyone with cron jobs, daily digests, or build pipelines that hammer Claude-P. And it includes anyone whose business model assumes they could pay $200 a month and get something like $5,000 of API value off the back of it. For that last group, the new credit is a graceful exit. Anthropic isn't shutting you down, they're moving you onto API economics and giving you a small starter allowance to soften the landing. So why are Anthropic framing it as a win? Well, it's worth pausing on the language for a moment. The Anthropic email uses warm, customer-friendly phrases like, "Oh, we heard your questions, your subscription usage limits don't change, no other actions needed." And all of those statements are technically true. None of them describe what's actually changing, though. This isn't unique to Anthropic. Every company does this when they take something away. Netflix didn't tell you they were introducing adverts on the cheap plan. They launched a new ad-supported tier. Banks don't remove your interest-free overdraft, they simplify your account benefits. And the pattern is the same. Announce a new thing, mention the loss only in the small print. The point isn't that Anthropic are being dishonest, they're describing a real change in a way that highlights the upside. That's communication, not deception. But if you only read the headline, you'll miss the trade. The thing to watch when a company says, "We heard you," is whether the change they made actually answers the question users were asking. In this case, users were asking for more subsidized quota. They got a smaller, capped, full price allowance instead. That's not the same answer. So what can you actually do about it? Well, some concrete suggestions depending on how you use Claude. If you're a casual user, do nothing. Claim the credit when the email arrives in June and carry on. The changes probably actually help you. If you write the occasional Claude-P scripts, keep an eye on your usage in the first month after the 15th of June. If you're nowhere near the cap, you're fine. And if you're burning through it in a week, look at where the tokens are going. Opus calls cost 5 times what Sonnet calls do, and many scripts run perfectly well on Sonnet or Haiku instead. And this is actually the professional move anyway. Even if you aren't having to pay those costs, and even if you're thinking, well, Anthropic's picking up the bill, you want to be acting as though you are taking those costs on board, because you want to be making the cheapest calls you can and the fastest calls you can. So using the model that is cheapest and fastest but still works is the right play regardless of all of these economic factors. However, if you're running a third-party harness like OpenClaw, then you really need to do the maths properly. Compare what your tool is doing today against the API prices. If it would cost more than $200 a month at API rates, you are running on subsidies, and that's the thing that's going to go away. Consider whether the work is worth paying API rates for, and if not, what a cheaper alternative looks like. I just want to pause on that point for a second, because if what you've been doing isn't actually financially viable on the new plan, then you probably just need to stop doing it altogether or find a way to make more value from what you're doing. If what you're doing is costing you $100 in API credits and it's just checking your emails and summarizing them for you, I suggest you can probably use either a free model or a much cheaper model to do it, or just read your emails yourself and create some automations. However, if you're building a product on top of Claude, this is a sharper warning. The subscription credit was never meant to be a commercial billing platform. Anthropic now state plainly in their own help docs that production automation at scale should use API keys. Build on API keys with a real contract and known unit costs. If you're feeling burned by the direction of travel, you have options. OpenAI's Codex offers a similar coding experience on a friendlier subscription model. Open models like DeepSeek and Kimi have caught up faster than most people realize and can be self-hosted if you have the right kit. Mixing providers through a router is more practical now than it has been ever before. None of these are a clear win over Claude today, but the options exist and Anthropic knows it does. And here are a few things to watch over the next 6 months. Firstly, the SpaceX capacity arriving later this month and possibly the beginning of next month. If it lands as planned, expect the temporary 50% rate limit boost, which is currently running until the 13th of July, to either be made permanent or replaced with something better. And I'd watch for announcements around there. Secondly, the new credit in practice. The first real test is the second half of June, once users have a few weeks of data. If the credit feels generous, Anthropic got the maths right. If Reddit fills up with $200 burned in a day posts, expect quite adjustments by the autumn. And finally, the next product change. The pattern this year has been introduce, walk back, reintroduce in modified form. The brief Pro Plan without Claude Code experiment in April is the cleanest example of this, and if Anthropic tries something similar again, say splitting Claude Code out of Pro entirely or introducing usage tiers within Max, the playbook is the same. Watch out for it. An additional note here, it's worth watching for the competition. The current chip squeeze is the main reason Anthropic can't offer more. As Amazon's Trainium 3 capacity comes online in late 2026 and Google's next generation TPUs arrive in 2027, the constraint changes, and so might the pricing. To summarise, the 200 Agent SDK credit is real and you should claim it. It will be useful for light automation work, for occasional scripts, and for trying out tools like OpenClaw without buying API credit upfront. But it's not a gift, and it isn't as generous compared to what subscribers had before. It's a careful and well-engineered move by a company that has been having a very difficult 9 months. A company that grew 8 times faster than it planned for, ran out of computing power, and had to find a way to keep its flat rate promise to most users while cutting off the small group of heavy users who were costing them serious money. A more realistic framing fits into one line. Anthropic moved automation off the subscription, called the move a credit, and counted on most people to read only the headline. And now you've read more than the headline.